Okay, so welcome everybody. Obviously, we've had a couple weeks off from this community sync, so we want to start this week strong with some demos from the work that we've done over the last couple weeks. The team's been ready, working pretty diligently on getting ready for release. So there's some great changes that we're ready to talk about. After that, we'll talk quickly about the state of the current, our Kanban board and our work in progress and kind of what's been going on there. Uh, uh, Along with talking about any tickets that may be out there where we would want some open contribution, right? And then we'll kind of wrap things up from there. So to start off with demo, James, do you want to kick things off there?
Suppose I can. We have some really, really interesting stuff that we have just merged. And we have issued it as one of our point release candidates. Now, it's probably worth commenting that we have now 19 release candidates, which is not normally the way that one uses a release candidate tag, which I recognize. But we are, just about to kick off a real major release after several delays and drawbacks, all of which were in the service of getting this even more productionalized so it can go on the Magento cloud. I would say that the highlight of the most recent batch of merges to our release branch is that checkout through Braintree is completely online. Thanks to Andy Terranova, some great work by him. And I can go through and demo that, and unless Andy, you want to, but I know that I'd be putting you on the spot, so I'm happy to do it.
Oh, sure. Thank
No,
you,
go
by the
for it.
way. I was planning on showing us some of the newer stuff, and I was going to kind of tackle, because I had previously shown it, but you can, for sure, whatever works.
Well, I'm going to let you do it and give you some time. So that I wanted to
Okay.
call that out first off because I think that's really the most momentous. But there are other things. Probably the most sort of user-facing and documentation-heavy new feature that has landed is the concept of portability in Venia components. Now, you may have heard that our notion of extensibility is due for expansion, and we have to add as much power and configurability to our extension concept that Magento has in order to satisfy our own mission. But for now, that's not entirely complete because we're trying to be very safe and not create extension concepts, allow partners to invest a lot of time and energy in creating value on those concepts, and then realize that they don't scale and have to roll them back and delete them. That's what a startup can do, and we can't quite do it that way. We can make features like a startup can, but for extensibility, right now, we are trying to stick to the existing concepts of extensibility and composability that already happen in the JavaScript ecosystem. The way that that would be done is by using the parts of PWA Studio as JavaScript modules that you import through dependency management. So with that in mind, we have, I'm just going to go ahead and go Venia consuming, oh, whoops, is that? Sorry, I'm not sharing my screen yet, am I? I'm going to just be a second to get this running. There it is. I am the opposite of Bruce Springsteen in that I'm terrible at blue jeans. Can y'all see this?
Yes, yes.
This is a public repository in the Magento Research Organization that we have made as a sample app that is not built on PWA Studio and yet consumes Venia separate components to use. You can see a demo of it here, and you can also see a demo of it here at this public site that we deployed on CI. It may run a little bit slow initially, so I'll go ahead and let it load. No, I don't have to let it load. People looking at it. You can see that this is, though it's perhaps not displaying really beautifully on this screen at this resolution because it's just a POC. You can see that there is a product detail component that's displaying static data here, and then a root component that, of course, is having a data fetch error, probably because there is an issue with routing, but I can show that to you in the local site. Just 1 second. React. So I'll run that in a second, but it's worth observing that if you look at the React developer tools, that you can see that this is an actual Venia component. It's minified, but it is importing. Where is it? You can see there's a classify component coming in from Venia, and that this is the actual product full detail from the Venia store. I also opened up a development store to show you the root component in operation. There you go. Now you can see in the local store that I've got running that isn't subject to the routing bug in our CI that not only can you use a presentational React component, which of course works just by injecting static data into it, but you can also embed a root component which knows how to fetch the data on its own. Now that's important to note because this means that not only can you use just Venia widgetry like the gallery and the category detail lists, but you can also use its logic and its workflow as separate consumable pieces. But of course, that logic and workflow needs to be able to connect to input-output, otherwise how does it fetch its data? So the way that we solved for this is that we created an idea called Venia drivers. This is not necessarily a new idea. This effectively is an adapter interface that gathers all of Venia's necessary things together. But what we did is try to implement it in a way that was unobtrusive and simple for you. We're not doing a giant dependency injection container. You don't really need to write your components differently. But the things that Venia uses in order to interact with the rest of the application are things like, the React router link components. Let me actually find a great example of that in Venia. In product full detail, I will go ahead and just go through the code very briefly. I know that code demos are not great demos, but it's probably worth observing that product full detail, can you guys see this okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Product full detail incorporates product options in its view, which incorporates a carousel, which incorporates an add to cart button, and those things connect elsewhere. And when you go all the way down to thumbnail, or this that actually renders those images on the side here, this thumbnail component uses the resource URL function. And it's that resource URL function that produces the URLs that it knows how to load from Venia, which, wait, what are these URLs? Simple URLs, they're not compressed or anything, but they know exactly how to pull them with the media catalog product prefix and everything from the Magento site. That's something that is tightly bound to the implementation of the Magento site. How does Venia do that and maintain its connection with Magento? Where does it define that configuration? It does so in Venia upward. So if you're using the full Venia site, you know that if it matches, media catalog, etc., that it's going to redirect to the proxy, and the proxy is going to just target the Magento backend URL. Simple enough. But let's say you're on a site that doesn't have this upward file and can't rely on the backend behaving that way. If you just use a Venia component by itself, as you can see as our consumer example does, check it out. Just importing Venia product detail, and it's tossing it in there. So how does this thing know that it needs to render its URLs in a way that directs back to the old site? Well, that's because it generates all of its URLs with this imported dependency called resource URL. And you can see an example of how that gets re-implemented here. And if you create a function that overrides this drivers dependency, and then you define a function resource URL and export it, then that is consumed by every Venia component, just like this thumbnail file. And it uses that to generate a resource and also to specify some things about that resource, like how wide it should be and what type of resource it is, to give hints for the resource URL to generate the right type of path name. So we'll get to those cool new additions later, but what that results in is the ability to generate a URL for your own implementation. The same thing holds for I'm going to go ahead and look at all the places that we use this new concept, this new dependency. Whoops. So if you look, for instance, at, I don't know, cart trigger, we have connect, or in category tree, we have query. And we don't import query from React Apollo anymore directly, because the query component expects there to be a provider at the top of the context. So it expects to be running inside the Venia app, essentially. So rather than using this React Apollo dependency as we once did, we switch it to this source drivers file. And then at our build step, we transpile it so that the string for you to override is Venia/drivers, which there is some documentation for that. Was it 794? No, it was 788. The pull request is closed now, and we're working on documentation for it, thanks in advance to James Calcaben. But there is some documentation, not only here, but in the source code as well, of source drivers that explains how you would override this dependency in your own build. Let's say Webpack, you do it like this. You want to replace this Magento Venia drivers dependency with my replacement drivers. And then your replacement drivers file can look, I don't know, something like this, that exports a different implementation of resource URL, maybe a different implementation of link, so it doesn't need React Router to be there. Otherwise, the link component will complain. Different implementation of query, so you just pretend that your queries are always loading. Effectively, this inversion of control allows you to import Venia components that expect a certain application environment, effectively a paragraph, and then inject that at build time. So you don't treat it like it's a new or different type of import. You just statically import it like anything, and then in your build configuration, you are adjusting the way that modules are resolved so that it brings in your app's dependencies. And in doing this, you can import Venia components and use them in line just like this. So in this implementation of this example, we have an application file that creates a couple of routes. It does use React Router, and there's a presentational component option. And I showed you that. The presentational component is just a simple setup that imports a little bit of hard-coded product data I threw in a gist, and then renders a Venia product detail. And that's a simple example. The container component, which actually incorporates root component's product, it doesn't even need to do anything because the app renders it directly. And all that it needs to do is examine the URL, just like a regular product detail page does, and then resolve that URL into a product, which is why you can see here that when I go to root component, or I'll go to root component here, that it's just that URL key that you're used to seeing in Magento. So if you import a full-size Venia component, then you've effectively imported the entire SEO sitemap of your Venia site if you want it to be that way, just in the products domain. So this is super powerful, and it permits you to import Venia components using an extensibility concept that's already well understood. And my demo of it here may have been a bit scattered, but you can take a look at it yourself, both in Magento Research Venia Consumer Example and in the new code and comments that have been merged in with pull request 788. So that's the cool part for extensibility sakes. And if you were paying attention, your sharp eye might have also caught that there was a width parameter in some of those image requests. So let's talk about that a little bit. If you go to veniapwa.com, and yes, that's what it is now instead of Magento Venia now.sh, you might notice that payloads seem a little bit smaller, especially these images. So that's the next big feature, is that we now have onboard image optimization in Venia. And more generally, we have added the concept of image optimization into the PWA Studio runtime and build time. The way that it works presently is that there is an image optimization middleware in both the development server and the staging server that serves Venio locally in production mode that intercepts requests to a particular route/image, and then you just add some URL arguments, which causes the resize and cache operation to happen in real time. That uses an off-the-rack component called Express Sharp, which is an image resizing library that's highly optimized, written in C, usually pretty easy to install and get running on any platform through Node. And it provides this API where you use query parameters just to source in an URL from another domain and do arbitrary operations on it. Change its format, change its quality. The way that it's currently set up, the default's pretty cool. It uses the brand new WebP image format when the client indicates that it can. And otherwise, it compresses JPEGs and PNGs really well optimally. But these URLs seem sort of yucky. Oh, sorry. These URLs seem sort of yucky. You might be pleased to note that in the core code base, category tile is what's rendering those URLs. And it doesn't have to do any of that horrible stuff because it uses, that's right, the resource URL method from before. So you don't have to generate those images. You have a single central driver file. And that driver file uses a make URL file from our utilities directory. And make URL is what does all of the Venio specific URL construction to turn a particular URL into a resized one based on the argued width parameter. Now there's more to do. If you look at the category tile, you might notice that that width parameter that we argue is preview image size, and that's actually presently hard-coded. Now we had some work out there to add responsive images and images that are art-directed using the source set attribute and the picture element. That pull request is still outstanding, and if you look in the pulls list for current state PWA Studio, which I totally know how to navigate to, then you can see that there is some work out there. I have to go down here a ways or I can't see it. It must be, Oh, you know what? We closed it, didn't we? So I guess that's not something people can look at super easily. But when it reopens, or you can certainly create your own, it would be great if we could replace these hard-coded things with some manner of responsive image element that detects both viewport size, display density, and can also interoperate with the style using some of the responsive image techniques that I won't go into now, but there's a lot of great resources on the web on. We were thinking about creating a component that was part of the core toolkit that lets you very quickly and succinctly insert an image that becomes responsive, kind of based on the style sheet. That's what's next. It's probably not going to arrive in the current release. But I've already taken up a lot of time, and again, these two things, while fantastic, are not what's most exciting to me, which is checkout. So I'm sure there are questions, and I'm excited to hear them. But let me throw it back to Andrew to run the rest of this because I know we've already taken up a lot of time. Thank you.
Sure. So I think we have 5 minutes left. I know we want to get to Andy's work on checkout. So Andy, if you're ready to go, let's just jump into it really quickly and try to move quickly but thoroughly through
it. Sure. Can you guys see the screen?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I've preloaded up a product into the cart, and so now I'm going to check out. And this was originally kind of some hardening around, right before our release. We want to put some polish on the checkout. So I open this little checkout drawer now. You may remember previously you had to enter these things in order. So you had to put your shipping information followed by the billing information followed by the shipping method. And we would kind of piecemeal send those things back to the M2 backend as you submitted each one. Now we instead are just saving those things to local storage, and we only submit to the backend when you click the confirm order button at the bottom there. So that's a little bit different. The local storage is so that I don't actually have to show you that, but so if you enter these things and then obviously end your session and come back later, it will remember them. So I can enter these things in any order. Let's see what else is interesting. There's a cancel button here, which will just close the checkout portion. Previously, it closed this entire drawer, which the X button still does. So this kind of does that. There's an edit kind of, there's a bunch of like CSS stuff too, but I'll skip over that stuff. There's an edit icon indicating when you have filled out one of these sections that you can go back and change the information that's in there. And then the interesting part, which I demoed once before, but it was like Andrew said a couple weeks ago at least, is the Braintree integration. So this is a Braintree supported widget, I guess is the easiest way to say that. There is some documentation around valid card numbers here that you can put in. You don't want to put in this is a sandbox Braintree account, so it has a set list of cards that you can put in there that it will accept. So this is kind of the most canonical fake card number. The number 4 followed by a whole bunch of 1s. Any date in the future we'll do here for the expiration date, and then any 3-digit CVV we'll do there. And that will go off to Braintree and request what they call a payment nonce. And then when we submit this thing, we submit that to the M2 backend, which then goes to Braintree itself and says, hey, I got this payment nonce. It's just like an identifier, really. And it says, is this thing valid? And then, Braintree says yes or no, and that's how you actually get charged. So I'll just complete the process here with good old Freddy Frankenfurter, all that stuff, and then you can submit this. You guys have all seen submit actually going through and giving you a receipt. But that was some of the new stuff. I'm trying to remember if I forgot anything major there, but I know you said we only had 5 minutes, so maybe that's a good place to end.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna get rid of this like get it by stuff based on code review comments, so don't take too much stock into that either. But that's it.
All right. Thanks, Andy. So any questions really quick on anything that James talked about, anything that Andy just demoed?
I do. I need to speak with Andy, but I will do that offline.
Fair enough.
Ooh. No, good things. Not
Wow.
That's what it felt like.
Andy, you and I need to have a chat.
Any other questions from anyone on the line on what they've demoed? Okay. So I would say, I don't know if Adrian's on the line. I know we've had some PRs from him that were submitted that would be maybe worth talking about, but I don't think he's on there. So with the last minute here, I guess I would say we haven't spent a lot of time looking at what's coming up in the backlog. I think, as a team, we had met a few weeks ago. I think we talked about how the team was going through the process of transitioning into more of a Kanban workflow, right? And as a part of that, we had purposely decided to limit the amount of work that's coming in, so that way we can catch up on existing work that's on the board, catch up on existing PRs that are out there in the review and QA column. So the team has been working really hard on that, and that's why we again have purposely limited, I think, the amount of backlog grooming and the amount of new work that we're accepting in. Obviously, in the next couple of weeks, we'll start to see that transition back more towards items in the backlog. So we'll start having those conversations more. So I would end it there, I guess, and say stay tuned. Next week we'll have probably less of a demo focus and more of a focus on existing work in progress and existing backlog items and the priorities coming up. So, all right. Anything else? Everybody feel good? All right. Yeah. Friday.
Hey,
Bro, anything?
It's just really heartening to see the performance improvements coming in now as well. So just kind of like, thank you for those. Like, I've been watching the image improvements come through and seeing the score steadily creep up. So yeah, excellent stuff.
Good stuff. All right. We end on a high note, which is always good.
Except for Andy.
Except for Andy. Okay, thanks everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.